As we learned in the previous video, language learning isn't just about learning new words. It's about changing the way that you think, and it's about switching into a Spanish voice every time you change from English to Spanish. This might sound weird, but an exaggerated way to think about switching voices is actually changing between personas. Imagine that you have multiple personalities. You use one when you speak English and another when you speak Spanish. Actually, if you ask anyone you know who's bilingual, they'll probably tell you that that's how they operate. Bilingual people don't just change what words they use when they switch between English and Spanish. They often change their phrases, their facial expressions, and even their mannerisms, almost as if they've changed personalities. In this video, we'll cover a lot of things about Spanish pronunciation so that you can start saying Spanish words with a Spanish voice. But we'll also talk about how to shortcut the personality switch necessary for becoming bilingual. The thing is, if you're a native English speaker, your English personality is already well established and developed. But your Spanish personality is brand new and in its infancy. You haven't yet discovered what new phrases, facial expressions, and mannerisms you're going to use for this new personality of yours. So we're going to shortcut the process by giving you a persona to imitate. This will be a fictional character, someone we've made up for the sake of this course. Yes, it's a bit weird for some people, and it's not mandatory that you do this if you don't want to, but it has helped thousands of students accelerate their path to bilingualism, and it can do the same for you. Meet Joel. This is the alter ego that most of our students use. He's a cartoon bee with some very strange habits, quirks, and mannerisms, all of which were developed to help you learn and imitate things about the Spanish language. Here are 2 things that Joel is going to do for you that will kick your Spanish learning into high gear. First, Joel is kind of strange and comical, and he makes lots of mistakes. And you're going to make lots of mistakes as well when you start speaking Spanish. You're going to feel like you don't know how to say even the simplest of things sometimes, which can be discouraging. But remember, you don't have to be personally offended or embarrassed when something goes wrong. Instead, your alter ego is to blame. He was the one that did it, not you, and this can help you learn and practice Spanish more boldly. If you're being Joel while you speak Spanish, you don't have to identify with your mistakes. It's all because your Joel persona is still learning how to speak properly. That way it's all just part of the act and it's all part of the process. Second, this made-up persona can help teach you Spanish faster by making the rules of Spanish second nature. As you learn how Joel speaks, you'll automatically learn Spanish pronunciation, vocabulary, idioms, and grammar. In this video, we'll begin by showing how Joel's personality affects his pronunciation and some of his manners of speech. But to start with, let's get to know him and where he's from. Joel lives on the planet of Yol, and sometimes he gets his own name confused with the name of the planet that he lives on. Joel has some extremely strange personality quirks. For example, he loves drinking tea, and he'll do almost anything to get a nice hot cup. But he has a strong distaste for all mammals, that is, animals with fur, such as dogs, horses, bears, and giraffes. Before it gets any weirder, remember that there's an explicit grammatical reason for every aspect of Joel's fictional personality, which we've put together for this mnemonic technique. The fake personality that we're building here will help you remember an incredible number of Spanish rules at once without having to think about them. For example, as the stories progress throughout this course, you'll see that Joel is a very mischievous bee, and while he tries to appear attractive and charming, he has the uncanny ability to use interesting and clever turns of phrase to persuade the people and the things around him to do work for him, because he's kind of lazy. This helps us remember that when speaking in Spanish, you're more likely to express that things are acting upon you rather than you acting upon them. It's a fundamental way that English and Spanish grammar behave differently. In other words, this and other aspects of Joel's fictional personality are valuable, memorable devices that will help make all the essential elements of the Spanish language, from core vocabulary to sentence structure, extremely memorable and vivid. Some more about Joel. Again, Joel doesn't like mammals. In fact, he's generally frightened of all such animals. However, his best friend is a lizard. He has no problem with him because he's a reptile, not a mammal. As you'll see in future stories, the lizard can't talk and likes to live in dark caves. Joel also hangs out with a group of stuffed pandas. They're okay because they aren't real pandas, they're living stuffed animals, which is not a problem by Joel's strange standards. Joel finds it particularly amusing to cause mischief to these stuffed pandas. He thinks it's funny when they get dizzy or blow around in the wind or anything like that, which happens pretty often. Now note that Joel has a strange tendency to get into sort of an odd mood and talk with an old-fashioned or quaint mode of speech when he's about to do something mischievous. So be on the lookout for that. If he starts speaking in a pompous voice, it usually means that he's up to no good. Another funny thing about the way that Joel talks is that he has a tendency to be extremely redundant in certain cases. He'll say the same thing more than once in a sentence, sometimes even to the point of bad logic, such as using double negatives. For example, I didn't see nothing, to mean I saw nothing. The fact is that we have to imitate even this to speak like Joel authentically. Of course, in order to develop a voice like Joel's, one of the first things that we want to think about is the accent that he uses when he speaks. So instead of T, his T's are not formed against the roof of his mouth as they are in English, T, but rather against his teeth, because his tongue goes so far forward in his mouth. So it's more like T. And then D is similar. It's more like D. Now, at the same time, his R kind of replaces the letters D and T. So his D and T are in the front of his mouth, D, T. But his R sounds a lot like our D or T when spoken really quickly. Unlike our sound in English where we go which can go on for a long time, the letter R is normally pronounced in Spanish as a single moment event. So to practice this, let's use Joel's favorite drink. If you say pot of tea really quickly, over and over, pot of tea, if you say it fast enough, the T at the end of pot of tea, will be pronounced exactly like the Spanish R. So say pot of tea. Then shorten it down just to pot of. And then if you use that same sound, say era. Instead of pot of, era. That's the sound of era, which is a Spanish word that has R in the middle. Although it doesn't sound to English speakers like an R, it is an R in Spanish. Era. Go ahead and alternate between pot of tea and era. So hop quickly back and forth between those two. Pot of tea. Era. This is a valuable exercise for practicing switching between your English voice and your Joel voice. You want to be able to imitate these sounds as soon as possible if you want to sound like a native Spanish speaker. Every time you're in Spanish mode, try to speak the way that Joel does, because again, he represents all native speakers for us in standard Spanish pronunciation. We'll hear Joel's actual voice very soon as he gives us examples of Spanish sentences, but for now, just try to keep these sounds in mind. So his T sounds like T, his D sounds like D, and his R is a single event. Ara. Another letter that's different for Joel, the letter J actually sounds like H. So see in this picture how the letter J is hanging down in front of his mouth, and he's trying to blow it away. So the letter J goes H. And this is part of why Joel likes to call himself Yol sometimes, and spell it with a Y instead of a J. When he tells his friends that his name is Joel, if he writes it out Joel, they might end up calling him Joel, which he doesn't like very much. He thinks that Yol sounds better. Now, Joel is a B, and the letter B for him buzzes a little bit, just like the letter V does in English. V. In fact, for Joel, the letters V and B sound identical. Both are pronounced V. Just remember that Joel is a buzzing B, and that should help with both of these letters. Other than T, D, R, V, and J pronounced as H, Joel's consonants are very much like English consonants, except that Joel does not believe in the letter H. It looks too much like prison bars to him, which is something he's always trying to avoid in our stories, so H would never ever make the sound for Joel, and it's basically always silent. Now for the vowels. Since Joel likes to talk very quickly and directly, his vowel sounds are extremely short. We can kind of hack this from English. So in English, if you put a silent H after the letters A, E, and O, you get roughly the sound that Joel always uses for these letters. And it never changes. The letter A is always A, which is sort of halfway between an A and an A. A. The letter E is always E, which is sort of like A, but pronounced as a single sound, E. And then O is always pronounced O. It's quite simple. I and you are a little different. If you think of an I and imagine that the little dot above it is Joel flying above the I, you can imagine that the dot is making sort of a little E sound, like a little bee, as he's flying. And that's the sound that the letter I makes in Spanish. So whenever Joel sees the letter I, he says E. You'll also quickly learn in the upcoming lessons that the letter U is U. Joel would never say U for a single letter because all of the letters in Spanish have a single short sound. So it's not as long and complicated as the English letter U. It's just a very simple sound. U. So the 5 vowels are A, E, I, O, and U. Now, all of this is just an introduction of things to keep in mind. You'll actually get to hear Joel speaking very soon, and you can simply imitate the way that he talks in general for all new words. But practicing what we just described with a few words can be helpful, so we'll do that now. Here's our first pronunciation exercise. I'll spell a word, and I want you to try to predict how it would be pronounced. We'll learn what these words mean soon. For now, just try to pronounce them exactly as Joel would. So this word is spelled V-E-R-D-A-D. How would this be pronounced? Verdad. H-O-L-A. So remember that H is always silent. So this is simply hola. M-E-J-O-R. Remember that the J is a h sound, with the J hanging in front of Joel's face. So this is mejor. V-I-D-A. So this would be pronounced vida. T-O-D-O. Remember the soft T's and D's with your tongue against your teeth instead of the roof of your mouth. Todo. Here's a fun one. That silent H in the middle might throw you off. It's ahora. B-I-E-N. So this one is just bien. S-I-E-M-P-R-E. Siempre. Remember to keep all of your sounds very short and crisp in Spanish. A fun exercise is to practice pronouncing any words that you come across following these rules as directly as possible. This will get you talking convincingly like Joel, and therefore like a native Spanish speaker pretty quickly. Now, going beyond pronunciation, there are also some interesting nuances to the ways that Joel talks and the ways that he structures his sentences. You'll want to pay close attention to him whenever he says something and be able to imitate the way that he structures his sentences. You don't want to have to think about all the rules all the time. Instead, you want to put yourself in Joel's frame of mind so that you can say things the way that he does in general. As some examples, Joel has a tendency to put his adjectives after his nouns instead of before them about half the time. Not all the time, but about half the time and in several situations that you'll pick up on very soon. It's also important to note that Joel does not like the word like. He'll pretty much say anything else he can say instead of like. So instead of saying, I like food, he might say, to me, food is pleasing. Or instead of saying, I walk like he does, he instead says, I walk as he does. Why is that? Well, simply because Spanish doesn't have a word for like. Instead, there are words for being pleasing, for wanting something, or for acting as something else. Also, for personal reasons, Joel avoids the ubiquitous English word get. If we're honest, Joel is always looking to get things in our stories, especially if he can get them for free and without doing the work himself. But he doesn't want people to know that he's always out to get something. So he almost always finds other ways to say get. There's a word in Spanish for the verb for to get, but it's very uncommon, and it means something more like to acquire. Joel doesn't like to use it much at all, and only uses it when there's no other option. Now, before we dive in and start learning some actual Spanish words in the next video, we need to set the scene by talking a little bit about the planet of Yol, which is where Joel lives. If you get to know this imaginary place, you'll be ready to fill it with Spanish words. The planet of Yol is a very strange planet. Everyone here speaks Spanish, but since they think that Spanish was invented here on the planet of Yol, they call it Español, naming it after their own planet's name. Yol is a warm but somewhat dimly lit planet with a yellow sky. As you'll hear in upcoming stories, their currency is actually Japanese yen. So you'll see people paying each other in yen all the time. Local to Joel's own town, there's an amusement park where he likes to hang out. There's a countryside which Joel has to go through to get from the amusement park to his home. And then there's an outdoor market nearby. There are also hundreds of shops lining the streets close to Joel's house. Now, Joel's own house is very large, and again, he is a very wealthy bee, and so he has lots of stuff, both outside in his messy yard, and various things inside that are categorized by room. As a bit of a spoiler, it's inside Joel's enormous house that we learn nouns. Other words are in various areas throughout the planet of Yol. You'll get to know these environments a lot better as we progress through the lessons, but keep this in mind. Joel has his local town and all these distinctly different places that he likes to visit, and we'll categorize our words in Spanish based on these places. We'll start learning our first few words in the amusement park in the next video. If you think it's strange to picture an imaginary planet and change your personality, remember this one thing. It works. It's worked for thousands of our coaching students in the past, and it will work for you as well. If you want to be able to speak Spanish effectively, you need to be able to turn off your English personality when you turn on your Spanish personality.